One of the explanations is that the timeline was threatened by these temporal distortions that resulted in operations involving temporal dislocation, transportation, or translocation, or relocation. And this is viewing as well as actual translocation. And so, as a result, there were changes which influenced our history. And so, our history, our timeline began to take on a convoluted effect. And this basically meant that events of history were changing, and as a result, the far future was becoming something different. And so, what was discovered is that when looking back to the past, there were events that were observed, and basically these events were replicated on a quantum level, meaning an entire scenario was mapped out with props and cloned, if you will, replicants inside of a time bubble, and this was anchored in to the timeline using advanced technology managed by these beings that were capable of doing so. And these artificial events were anchored in, and thus we were anchored to them in the timeline that we are on now. And so, or at least we were on then. And so these were viewed, and at first it was believed that these were real events, when upon traveling to these times, it was discovered that these entire events, the literal location, was basically a movie set. It was a 4-dimensional movie set. Everyone there was basically running a kind of script, and all the events, all the objects were props. They were literally atomically or molecularly replicated and put into place, and the actual location was inside of a time bubble, basically a distortion bubble, a field, and it wasn't actually within a universe, or at least the original universe. It was basically held in a temporal dimension. There's a word, it's called an artificial dimension, which is pretty much you could view your computer and the desktop and operating system that's on there as an artificial environment. Say you go in and program your computer or program an operating system, you've essentially created an artificial environment. And so now the allegory, or maybe the example, is a parallel. It's the exact same. These beings have the ability to program matter, and from that to create a distortion field and have their own space, their own environment, which is as if they're their own computing environment. And from there they use the replicating abilities to program matter, and then they basically code an entire environment, an entire scene. And so this has been done throughout our history. Upon going back and actually, once we developed the technology to not just view back in time, but to transport materials and personnel, we actually interacted with these environments. And it is like the Chuck E. Cheese robots that kind of turn and make a few specific motions, and then that's all they can do. That was literally what these events were like. Certain scenarios, assassinations, key events in history, assassinations, disasters, discoveries, certain events like these were entirely fabricated. And when going back to interact with the scene, it was like playing a simple video game environment over and over again. There was no malleability, there was no genuine variability to the environment. So there was no variability to the environment. It was just like a video game when, in the movie, what was it called? Existence. That was the simulation, a virtual reality movie, a video game. It was like in that video game environment when the person didn't say the right thing to get to the next level of the game, the people around them would just kind of go blank-minded, and when the person tried to interact with them again, that person, the computer person basically, would repeat the same last sentence that they said before until that player, the real player person, would come up with the right response. And so that's kind of how these environments responded. It was literally a pre-programmed 3.5-dimensional bubble universe, a bubbleverse, that was being created by these entities that were doing one of two things. And that was the main idea, that we can come down to what was going on, to determining that, the details. But now the question of why, how, we've gotten to. And so the how is, when our technology got to that point, from having scientists go in and out of our own distortion fields for years at a time, to develop all that can be developed technologically and then continue the process, we accelerated very quickly technologically. And so when our technology got up to the speed where we could recreate events had we wanted to, we understood how they were doing this. We understood what was happening, and we understood how. The why, the overall results, and how it related to them, what we meant to them, that was more confusing, and it's pretty difficult even to explain. So these entities were anchoring the timeline in, and there's one of two reasons. Either this is to replace the present through the introduction of these artificial pasts, these artificial past events, or, well, in order to do that, and then in order to create a future which is desirable to them, i.e. it leads up to somehow or another the creation, proliferation, or sustaining of their species. And so somehow they either convert us or take over and inhabit the society or build a temporal bridge, and they could be parallel basically, maybe meaning they don't have, this is not being done for the future production of themselves in some way or another, and at that point it's a completely different reason. And so as part of that explanation, this could be that as a result of these operations, timeline was distorted and convoluted and couldn't exist in the way that it was previously, the organic version, or, without collapsing. And so as a result of the distortions, instead of collapsing or after collapsing or at the point of collapsing, these beings, these entities who are capable of moving in and out of time or across the dimensional barriers, moved in and began stitching the timeline together using these artificially generated environments and events, and through that, sustaining our time to the point where a collapse wouldn't be the result of the distortions. And it's a really weird story of how all this came about and how, how we got to this point. Basically involves a lot of operations and operatives seeing these beings in action, trying to reverse what they're doing, then experiencing these beings reversing or countering our attempts to reverse what they were doing, and all the while assuming that they must be maliciously motivated, and yet being unable to really gain the upper hand and not really understanding how. And there's a whole bunch of weird stuff and confusion that results, such as another faction recreating the biology of these beings to use as their own, essentially, military force, interdimensional military force, which then has the capacity for psychotronic warfare weaponry built into their biology. And so that obviously made things a lot more difficult and unfavorable for those trying to understand and mediate the situation. And there's a whole host of stuff from there, from weaponry to reverse engineered weaponry to attacks and counterattacks to espionage to cloning human entities that were then guided by these beings to then these beings being reverse engineered and then being controlled by humans. And it was basically just a kind of interdimensional war or chess game that went on from the beginning of civilization, because once one epoch, if you will, or more so layer of history is kind of riddled with these distortions, the only place to go is further back. And so it went, and it went, and it went until it reached the beginning. And thus, we have the convoluted creation of how things got to be the way they are today, which is confusing, but it's kind of how these paradox scenarios work out, that what we basically have always experienced turn out to be quote-unquote new events inserted into time as a result of operations and changes that occurred halfway through what we consider to be the whole timeline. But because of the way time works, everyone's perception sees these events and sees this timeline as simply being the way things always were. There's no retrocausality that changes anything. It's just the way this universe always was. Now, there are a few specific individuals, operatives, that come, or at least have been to, and some come from the original timelines. And they hold the knowledge of how things were, meaning before the time wars, if you will. And we would call these some other kind of being because they're human, but they would be the unadulterated, non-genetically modified, non-mind controlled, basically non-bred for stupidity versions of humans. So they're liberated. and they've played a part in everything that's been going on. In the same sense, there's the other side that's more or less been playing the opposite role with the same level of intensity. And so it's kind of confusing. I know I probably confused a lot of people that listen to this. Hopefully the last ones haven't been too confusing. Ask questions. The last one was probably one of the most confusing, excuse me. And I think I got the most questions out of that, which is still not too much, but I'm going to base everything off of what people are looking at and thinking and feeding back based upon what I'm giving them. And that way there's this kind of multiple conversation that's taking place between what I'm presenting and the public. And that's probably going to be one of the easiest ways to go about refining the information in a way that will be understandable. However, it's never easy. Going through and being shown these events and seeing them and being there while it happened, you know, in Operation Younger, it's not an easier understanding. I mean, it is, because it's right in front of your eyes. And you know for instance, the weapons that are used or the resistance and the confusion because it's being done to you. But it's blatantly being done. Whereas the same thing's happening here, it's just behind the scenes. So there are entities that alter time as the human teams were going around more or less unwittingly distorting time, and some of these operations seem to be by entities that were healing the timeline, and others were basically these designed beings that match ancient descriptions of these types of controller entities, maybe demiurgic entities, and they were creating further distortions or mapping out the convoluted timeline to basically create a completely like a prison timeline. And so this is part of the time war and the time wars, but it's really just one time war. I mean, really, what does it mean if there are multiple, if it's regarding time itself? Well, there can only be one, because it's throughout time. It's inherent, it's a given, because it's a time war. And so time war basically ends, and another one would begin to make time wars once people are liberated from the first one. Therefore, the war ends. And once it ends, it's not going to start up again. So there's really only one, and it's ending now, because we're at a threshold now, because no more can be changed without destroying the whole thing. So the only other option is for people to realize what's been going on and make a decision from there. And that's pretty much the basis of it.